Welcome to Speak from the Body, a podcast that seeks to explore the wealth of wisdom of the body. My name is Avni Trivedi, and I'm your host, as well as an osteopath, doula, and movement teacher. In this podcast, I speak to experts about all sorts of topics to do with the body, such as touch, trauma, body confidence, gratitude, birth, movement, relaxation, and baby development. My wish is that you learn how to connect with, listen to, and respect your body. Today I'm speaking with Mangala Holland. Mangala is a women's empowerment and sexuality coach, an international facilitator of women's groups, retreats, and workshops. She's on a mission to help women become empowered through loving themselves fiercely, celebrating their sexuality, and overcoming the fear, guilt, and shame that keeps them playing small. Having over a decade's experience in the industry, her superpower is helping women become deeply connected to their body, pleasure, and orgasmic potential, which is the natural birthright of every woman. She's trained over 25 intimate body workers in Australia and places a strong emphasis on self-love, embodiment, and empowerment, teaching in a no BS, grounded, dogma-free style. I'd like to welcome Mangala to the podcast. Hi, thanks for being here today.
Hi, Avni. Thanks for having me on. I'm so happy to be here.
You mentioned just before we started recording that you're busy organising your summit, and by the time this comes out, the summit would have been and gone. But I'd love to know the reason for it and what it's about and what you're hoping to gain from it.
Yeah, so vagina, pussy, vulva, lifting taboos of female sexuality, power and wisdom. And yeah, this kind of just dropped through one night when I was trying to get to sleep, and just the inspiration came through, and it was really strong. It's like, you need to do an interview series, interviewing like so many different experts in things like birth, menstruation, menopause, pleasure, orgasms, trauma, all the things connected to the female body that are often considered taboo even in this day and age. And the impulse was so strong, I had to sit up, put the light on, make some notes in my phone, and even just like the speakers I wanted in the series. And then I sat on it and did nothing for 6 months because I went into some kind of contraction around, who am I to be doing this in the world? And then just leaned in and did it. And now I've recorded almost all the interviews, and we're going live next week with the interviews, so that's middle of November. So yeah, it's been a real labor of love. What I've really enjoyed about this is really having some incredible conversations, and feeling this weaving together of everything. There's no separation between sexual energy, pleasure, healing, the experiences that women go through in birth or menopause or starting menstruation or connecting to their cycles. There's so much wisdom that we have here in this area of our body, and a lot of the work I do with my one-to-one clients is helping them reconnect to their body when they're feeling disconnected and shut down, so that they can feel more confident in their lives and access more pleasure, and it impacts every area of life. And that's the common theme that's come through all of these conversations, is this this, that it all weaves together and all of this wisdom is connected. So yeah, it's been a real labor of love, and it's taken on a life of its own.
And it's wonderful to see such a bold title as well, because there's still so much debate of what should a woman's parts be called. So just to see the boldness is great.
Yeah, and that came through because I've been in like sacred sexuality circles for around 12 years, and I've been and I started off in what I thought was classical tantra, and it turned out to be Neotantra and it was a bit dodgy. But what I kind of discovered through that was, like, for the last 10 years I've been using the word Yoni to describe my genitalia, and when I've been working with clients. And then as I've been going deeper in my anti-racism work in the last year, and it started to not sit right with me that, well, even though I'm initiated into a classical tantra lineage, where the word Yoni is used to represent genitalia and the womb space of the goddess. How does that sit with me as a white Western woman using this terminology for myself or for my clients who are mostly Western women on the whole? And so it's like, well, that feels like cultural appropriation. And I raised it with my anti-racism mentor, and she was like, well, it's your call. She said, if it's not sitting right in your body, then that's a revelation for you to unpack. And that revelation led to the name of the series, because it's like, well, when the idea first came in, I was like, I'm going to do a Yoni summit. And maybe that's why then I sat on it for 6 months. I don't know. But the fact that then it just kind of dropped in was like, well, what name do we want to use? And when I started having the conversation with my clients about what words they used, rather than me telling them, oh, listen to your Yoni, or how does your Yoni feel? It's opened up a much deeper inquiry, because a lot of us hold so much shame, even around the words we were given as girls by our parents. And I've spoken to some friends of mine from South Asian descent who, the translation for the word they were given was shame, and it's
it was funny actually, because you'd written a Facebook post about this, and someone else had commented about shame, and it just triggered a memory for me of I grew up with shem, and actually that means shame, but I didn't at that point know. So it would be of any time that you see flesh, you see your belly or whatever, my mum would say shem, and it was said in a jokey way, but it's
and
this
shaming. Stuff goes really, really deep. It goes so deep, and all of us have been given words that maybe we didn't resonate with, and for a long time I didn't resonate with the word pussy. I've had to do a lot of work around that, and the book Pussy: A Reclamation was really, really powerful in helping me look at that. And I'm still kind of sat with, well, what word feels right to me? So it's an ongoing inquiry for myself.
You mentioned about your one-to-one clients coming when they're feeling disconnected or numb. Like, how does that show up in daily life?
So what I often get is women coming to me saying, I've completely lost my libido, or I'm stuck in my head all the time, and I just don't want to, I've just lost all interest in intimacy or self-pleasure, or my life's just feeling dried up and I feel just not confident in my life. And so it might express itself in the bedroom, but when we unpack everything, it's affecting, it's every area of life. And so, someone can go to therapy for a long time, or, try and address things from different angles. But if it's coming from you can't solve these problems at the level of the mind sometimes like coming at things from a different angle, from a more embodied place, can be very, very helpful. And what often happens when we start unpacking this stuff, and I give women tools to empower themselves to just gentle movement practices where they can get into their body more, or explore things, and not necessarily in a sexual way, so that suddenly they lose the shame they've had around their body image, or they're more able to create healthy boundaries with their family, and they start to unpack some of the stuff about the conditioning they received from the parents, and it affects every area of life. So it goes quite deep. And it's also really, really common that my clients start experiencing orgasms, sometimes for the first time, which is wonderful. And I get this all the time from my clients. It's like, oh my God, I've just experienced something on I think that was my G-spot, and it was completely numb before, and now I'm experiencing all these incredible sensations, and I feel all warm and glowy, and that was quite a cosmic experience. And I'm like, yeah, great. So, yeah.
It's not really a surprise that women are often experiencing that in later life, because where else does it ever get taught? Like, I remember our sex education at school was all about AIDS prevention, and all of my friends were just scared into just we could catch AIDS. That was like the biggest message. So there was never anything about pleasure. And also, you're conditioned to be under the male gaze all the time, or the things that are represented on screen are from a male
absolutely.
perspective.
And I think I remember back to the sex education I had at school, it was literally just don't get pregnant. That was the main that was drummed into us, just don't get into trouble. And that's the messaging I received very strongly from my parents as well, and it put the fear of God into me. Never received any education around pleasure or boundaries, consent, any of that stuff. And I know that's changing a bit now in some areas, particularly with boundaries and consent, but very much, I didn't learn there was anything more to my pleasure other than the clitoris until I was in my late 30s. And as a couple of the experts I interviewed in my interview series was kind of beautifully reframed it, we retrain or we upskill in all areas of our lives professionally as we go, we're constantly doing online courses of this or that, so we can become better skilled at what we do in the world. But we don't necessarily do that with sexuality. And there's a lot to learn. There's always more to learn about ourselves, and what we like, what we don't like, and how to experience more of that. And by taking the shame out of that, I think we can go a long way in society.
You said the phrase fear of God, and I'd love to talk about spirituality and sexuality and where they interact and where they stay separate.
So I mean, that is interesting, that fear of God statement came out. That's something that was very drummed into me, because my dad was a lapsed Catholic. So although he'd kind of rejected that kind of strong spiritual or religious dogma, and it still came out in weird ways. Like, it was very clear to me not to get pregnant outside of marriage, sex before marriage was considered really bad. And so I grew up with a lot of shame. I think it really impacted the sense of shame around my sexuality, which kind of really came online very strongly in my teens. And so it made me feel like a very bad person for having all these desires. So as I've got older, and when I started exploring Neotantra and classical Tantra, and just understanding that sexual energy is just life force, that it is just a current of energy. And when it flows freely, our lives are more harmonious and things flow better and we're in a better mood, and I'm able to be more productive in the world. And then money flows to me more easily when this current of energy is running smoothly. And that it's, and seeing it in that really pure essence, that it is just, they talk about Shakti in the classical Tantra tradition as this current of energy, and that's what this is. And so that really helped me to understand that for myself, and just feeling this as like this really pure current of energy, that when it flows freely, I have all these amazing good feeling hormones in my body. I feel more relaxed, and that I don't see it as separate. But it took me a long time to get there because of the cultural conditioning. I know this is something that a lot of us in our lives struggle with. And I see it with clients I've got all over the world. I've got a client in the US who grew up in a really strong religious family, and she's still kind of walking these two worlds. And she's like, well, how do I express this other side of me? And then when I go, I still have to go to church on a Sunday, and I'm expected to wear this really formal wear, and I've got to go because of my family. And it's like, how do we walk all these worlds together and integrate those? So it's a really important part of it. And what I bring it down to is, I don't believe there's anything in the world that isn't sacred, that everything in life, the ordinary, I'm just looking out my window now, and although I'm in a very urban environment, there's some beautiful plants just growing in the garden, and I can see a pink flower, and that's part of the world, and that's divine and sacred, just as my body is divine and sacred, and there's no separation. And so this is what I kind of encourage everyone to kind of get to a place of, and also within that is exploring pleasure in a wider context, not just sexually, but seeing seeing the pleasure in everyday life through our five senses. So what can I taste? What can I smell? What feels good to me? And that all of that to me is spiritual. And I just feel that that's a doorway in for people. And when I'm working with my clients, I leave it to them whether they have a spiritual awakening, which often happens during orgasm. They feel connected to something much greater than just themselves. But I leave out, any imposing of my spiritual beliefs, or I just give them space to discover what it means to them, and that's really beneficial.
That's so beautifully explained, and I think of the suppression that can happen of sexuality and how that can show up as just so much abuse and power imbalance and things. And also the way that you describe it, it just steps away from any of the things to do with modesty, or, just, it's got a very, like, just even that sensual connection, it's got a very different flavor.
Yeah. And I see it as it does have a very a very different flavor. And and I think back to I remember one spiritual teacher saying at one point that when we're really, really young, we have all the, like toddlers, we have all this exuberance, and we can be very spontaneous and very free and creative and just uninhibited. And then at some point, our parents or society kind of encourage us to be a good girl, to be quiet, to please other people, and we get squashed into this box, and our spontaneity gets, and that wild energy gets squashed and gets controlled and gets contracted. And when that happens, we ingest that, and then that pops out later on in our sexual expression, that we don't feel comfortable making sound or moving our bodies in a certain way, or we're more conscious about how we look rather than and we're not able to express ourselves fully. And that kind of blocks a lot sexually as well. And that's something I help my clients with as well.
What's interesting is you were talking about boundaries, and sometimes there's a perception that if someone is so free, then they're completely wild and they don't have any ability to kind of, move in the world in a conventional way. But what you're talking about is a sense of, there's a liberation, but there's also clarity, which is
unusual. And I
think
what it comes down to for me and my clients is I'm really passionate about helping people know themselves so fully that they know what's right for them and they can orient towards that, and they know what's like that doesn't feel good, or maybe if it's a maybe, that's not a full yes, and encouraging them to get really clear on their no's and their yes. And so really feeling strong in that, and then the energy can flow freely, because you can't fully relax and surrender and soften and all that juicy stuff unless you feel safe, unless you feel comfortable and confident. So I feel like there needs to be a certain level of structure so that the energy can flow freely. Because if you're just going out and being leaky, I call it kind of the leaky sexual feminine kind of floppy that I've seen in some kind of sexuality circles at workshops and stuff, where that's what's modeled as, the feminine. And I got stuck in that trap for a few years of like, I just need to let go and everything else. And it's like, that's not necessarily authentic. And I think it comes back to finding our truth and our authenticity. And that's when we can feel confident in allowing our pleasure to run freely, and to be able to ask for what we want as well, which is also a crucial thing.
I'd love to know more of how you describe what a no feels like on a body level.
Oh, that's a good one. So it's a big part of the work I do with my clients. So, for example, I'm working with a few women one-to-one at the moment who have come to me because something's shown up that they're having trouble sexually, and particularly with a partner. Rather than just like, right, do these tools to become more intimate with them. I mean, what we're doing is we're unpacking, helping them discover pleasure for themselves. And what that's meant is slowing everything right down and getting them to listen to what feels like a no in their body. And sometimes that means that then they have less sex with their partner, because they're not overriding all those times where they're doing it out of obligation or because they feel they should. and making sure that they're only being intimate when they're getting a hell yes. And it takes what we're doing is rewiring all that old patterning. And so feeling a no in the body, it can vary for different people, but it's like you have to discover this for yourself. But it's when I feel a no in my body, it feels like a contraction rather than an expansion. So what I might notice is my guts kind of clench, and even as I'm talking, I can feel my belly contracting in and my pelvic floor contracts, and it's a sense of like, it's a pulling away. It's rather than an opening towards, or a softening, or a relaxing, a leaning in. It has a very different kind of quality. So the more clear we are on that, the better, I think. And also it's also knowing, well, where is the middle ground? Where's okay, if I know my hell yes and I know my no, well, what happens when I'm like, I'm not sure about this. I'm not getting a clear either way. That's the interesting middle ground. And that's where we can spend some time to get deeply intimate with ourselves and not make rash decisions, I would say, and just be okay with sitting in the not knowing for a while until it becomes clearer. And that's in every area of life. Like if I get an offer to, talk on something or collaborate with someone, there's some things I'm like, oh God, yes, this feels so aligned. And then other times I'm like, in the past, I would have said a default yes, and then maybe a week down the line, being like, oh, hang on, I'm not sure how I feel about this. So it's just like learning that wisdom and that maturity to kind of sit and say, I'll get back to you when I've got a clear decision on these kind of things. Is super helpful, and I will wait until I feel that.
That's been such a big learning for me, even down to things like squeezing in an extra client, even if I've had a really packed day, or doing something for someone that they've asked for. Sometimes the no can feel really confronting, when actually it's not okay to override a body signal for the benefit of someone else.
And I see this particularly when I'm working with people who work for themselves, particularly women. I don't know about you, but what I found in my private practice, particularly as I've been growing my business, or I go in a busy launch period like I have been recently, it's just like there's a window where shit's got to get done, and I have to overriding the background levels of tiredness, or I'm feeling like, okay, I'm starting to hit the wall here. I need to really factor in self-care, and really listening to that, and taking proactive steps to make sure I don't hit the wall. And that's been a big lesson. And overriding my own boundaries to squeeze in an extra client or an extra call in the day, or starting earlier than I'm really ready to, or a bit later in the evening, particularly with international clients. I've really had to learn that the hard way over the years. But I know, it's worth doing that investigation, and it's worth setting aside that time. So like for myself this weekend, this series is launching live on Monday, and I've just got my period this morning, and I'm so grateful that I've set aside this weekend to be offline and just to rest, and I haven't got anything in the diary. I'm planning on not being on the computer at all because I'm feeling pretty zoomed out. And I'm just looking forward to whether I go for a walk in nature, or whether I spend the weekend reading in bed or doing a bit of gardening. But it's just, it's just really knowing what my body needs.
You were mentioning Tantra and being initiated in classical Tantra and Neotantra. I'd love to talk about what is Tantra and what are the different
It's a good
types.
question. So classical Tantra is, there's many different lineages, but the way I would describe it is that it's a very particular prescribed set of, it involves a very particular prescribed set of practices that are really about working with particular deities, Hindu deities in particular, so that you're kind of honoring those deities through practices of rituals, of pujas, meditations, fire ceremonies, different ways of worship with those, with the intent from the deity. So if I'm doing my puja in the morning, where I'm doing offerings to Ganesha, it's like on one level I'm offering 5 elements, the different 5 elements, as a form of worship to Ganesha, but at the same time it's a worship of myself, that I am not separate from Ganesha, and it's a way of allowing us to merge. It's very particular, it's very prescribed, there's lots of rules, it's very technical. I'm a bit of a geek, and I love that side of things, and I'm a very devotional person. So these practices work really, really well for me. And at the pure essence of it is about becoming one with the divine, and there being no separation. It's non-dual. Neotantra is much more, it's something that's particularly come through since the 60s and the 70s, and Osho and some other teachers, and is more about bringing sexuality into it, and sacred sexuality. And that becomes this, what they've done is taken some elements of like the masculine, feminine, Shiva being the male principle, Shakti being the female principle, and seeing this kind of lovemaking between the two, and using sacred sexuality practices and worship of the body as a gateway into that. And there can be some blurring between Neo and classical Tantra. And in classical Tantra, in some lineages, there are specific practices which include some sexual practices, but they were really designed for, you know, high-level practitioners who'd done the groundwork. It wasn't entry-level stuff. So there is a big difference, and there's a big blurring. And I'm really passionate about people getting clear on which they're practicing, because a lot of Neo-Tantra practitioners will just say they practice Tantra. And I would like more clarity of that within the industry, which is something I'm quite passionate about, banging on about.
And I read a blog post that you'd written about safety within Tantra and things for people to look out for. I'd love if we could just talk about a few of those.
Oh, yeah. So this has been a big journey for me. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate about doing the work I do is because I ended up in a pretty dodgy very dodgy Neo-Tantra environment for a few years that turned out to be a cult. And there was a lot of manipulation of women. There was a lot of sleeping with male teachers as a road to enlightenment or sexual awakening. And so what I've seen in that is a lot of power abuse. And what happens is, and I see this a lot in more diluted forms in a lot of the sexuality circles of a lot of male teachers who have got this following of lots of young, beautiful, often young, beautiful women who are often got a lot of trauma behind this in their lives, and they're seeking genuine healing and spiritual awakening. And it's very easy to get swept up by these charismatic people who know exactly how to manipulate and stuff. So and this can show up in, I see it in a lot of the spirituality world. I see it in yoga circles, meditation groups. It's not just in this specific sexuality space, but it does show up there more often. And this drove me to really think, well, why would we want to learn about female sexuality from old white dudes? Why have they got the position of power? This is just patriarchy 101 popping up in a different outfit. So I'm really passionate about giving women tools to discover their sexuality and their pleasure for themselves, and through learning this through people who've got the same body parts. Just bring it down to basics. But some red flags to look out for are anyone who tells you, I don't believe you ever need to be in an environment where you need to sleep with the teacher to be initiated into something, or to be healed, or to have your blockages healed, which is something I heard a lot. I don't believe that's something that ever needs to come out. And what's become really big and fashionable in the last few years is intimate body massage, whether it's Yoni massage or pelvic floor massage or whatever label you want to call it. And there's a lot of guys out there practicing this, and I would always say, if you're interested in exploring this, and it can really clear some physical blockages and undo some stuff that you're holding inside, and can be very, very powerful. But wait until you feel ready, and look for a female practitioner, and make sure you feel you can trust them. Is really essential. And if you're going into any workshop, there's a lot of stuff out there, good, bad, and ugly, in this realm. And of course, a lot of people are curious, and they want to learn more, and they want to expand, and they want to explore what all these amazing orgasms feel like, or explore a deeper level of intimacy and this kind of stuff. And it can be really profound. Just do your research, do your homework, ask around about teachers if you're not sure. Ask your friends if a friend recommends a teacher or a practitioner, tune in and check for yourself how you feel about them, because I've seen it all the time where people are like, oh, this person's amazing. And then I'm like, well, you might think they're amazing, but I don't actually resonate with something about them, doesn't feel right to me. And if something doesn't feel right, or you're not sure, then trust that. And it might be their social media posts, it might be their website. Sometimes you can get a good feel for something just from that. But if you're curious about a workshop, ask questions, speak to the facilitator before, find out what's going to be involved. And I would also say, get your own boundaries in place before you go into there, so that you're clear. I'm not going to take my clothes off in this workshop. I'm not going to go into something that's going to push me over my edges, and get really clear on that before you go in, so that you can honor that, because you might be the only person in that group who has to say no, and that's a hard place to be.
I just love that idea of asking that many questions before a workshop, because it's so easy to be like, that person's the teacher and they've got the knowledge and I'm the seeker, so I'm coming for that knowledge, rather than actually the self-empowerment of what am I trying to gain from that experience.
Yeah, it's so easy to get swept up in the group dynamic of, oh, everybody's going wild and having a good time and, making all these sounds, and it might just be doing breath work or something, but, you might be sat there thinking, oh, hang on, that doesn't feel safe to me. My body's not liking this. What's wrong with me? And that makes you feel like you're the only one. And, well, if they're all okay, then it means there's something wrong with me. And, or sometimes in these containers, it's set up in a way that, like, you can always say no if you want, but if you're the only one who's going to say no, you're going to feel that's going to be a difficult place to be. So the more we can really trust ourselves before going into these spaces, the better. Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that the idea for your summit came as like a download, and I'm curious about your relationship with your thinking side of you and your body connection. Like, how do you work with both?
Oh, that's a good question. So I found, I am a very structured person in general. I'm what in some, you could call quite masculine. I've got a very, very strong drive and a very strong, clear idea of what I want in life, and goals and this kind of stuff and objectives. But when it comes to like launching programs or ideas for what I want to put out in the world, that tends to come through in a very creative, felt sense, flowing. And I found if I override that and I try and do things just from my head, they bomb. They don't work, and I don't get people signing up very much. Or it's like I have to kind of sit with things. So I'm a big believer in like having both. So what I tend to do is, for myself, I will spend time every morning when I've done my practices. I'll just spend time in just an open inquiry and kind of connect into the idea of the soul of my business. And I just kind of just ask for just whatever wants to come through. There's all these unmanifested ideas or creative energy or whatever it is that is just a pure source of energy. And I'm the channel for what is meant to come through. So I kind of just sit in the unknowing and I wait until I get the inspiration. So sometimes that drives my business coach mad, because she's like, you should be just getting more out there in the world, or, do this on this date. And I'm like, oh, I've had to push this thing back because I'm just waiting for the next thing to drop in that feels right. It's an interesting place to be. So it's like a body mind feeling. So what happens is, if I get an idea, then sometimes I need to do some movement practice until I feel like I'm congruent with it, or it's like making sure my body is online with what my brain's trying to tell me. And that's an interesting conversation between the two. And it's not necessarily a fast one. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's
I
not.
like that description of the business as energy or as an entity of its own, like it has its own kind of magnetism or its own vitality.
Yeah, and that really takes the pressure off my nervous system and my energy levels, and me just trying to do little me and put things out in the world. It's like, no, there's something much bigger, and I've just got to open up and do the donkey work to let it come through. Is very liberating and freeing, and yeah, it just allows for much more expansion and bigger things to come through, because there's no way, like even a year ago, that I would have had the chops to put this out in the world. I don't think I would have had the courage to do it, you know, but because it's such a strong message that came through, it's like, oh, this needs to be out there.
How do you deal with the naysayers, like say for the summit, because it's so bold? Have you had people that have been criticizing or shaming, or have you received any negativity?
No, not
Wow.
one, actually. Yeah, which is interesting. Now, whether that's because I've curated my social media and my email list to an extent that, you know, people who follow me are on board with the message I'm putting out in the world. I feel some contraction because I feel it's an area I can't talk to my parents about. You know, like I've shied away from telling them, oh, hey, I'm doing this thing. They know I work in sexuality. They don't want to know more than that. They're just like, we don't want to, it's like, don't ask, don't tell. They're very, very English in that way. But that's okay. We've reached an unspoken understanding about that. But regards to the pushback in the world, no. And I think because we're bringing in conversations around menstruation and health, as well as pleasure and orgasm, we're coming at it from an angle where I do believe there's something for everybody. And if someone comes to this because they're looking for a specific healing on a physical level, then maybe this will spark some inspiration for something else. Where I'm feeling that I will probably get some pushback is because I'm leaning towards being as inclusive as I possibly can. So I'm really trying to amplify the voices of marginalized people. So I've been actively getting as much as I can to encourage women of color to be in this series. And I've got a couple of trans educators, and this is an area where I'm feeling a little bit outside of my comfort zone. It's an area I want to grow in and be able to hold a more inclusive space. And so I've been having those very vulnerable conversations as part of this series so that I can educate my audience and we can kind of learn together. And I'd rather lean in and stumble and perhaps mess it up rather than just step back and not say anything and not include these people. So I'm feeling that I'm going to get some pushback from some of the spiritual community on this because they're not as open to this. And I've been having very open conversations about white privilege in some of these spiritual circles and, you know, marginalized voices. So that's an interesting thing. And I am expecting a bit of pushback, but I've not had it yet. So I'm curious to see how that's going to evolve. And as you mentioned earlier when we were talking about naming body parts, that's been a fascinating conversation with these trans educators because they've had to redefine their genitals for themselves as what do they call these parts. And that has been a really liberating conversation. And I think those of us with female bodies can learn a lot from people who identify differently and not just as what we were assigned at birth, and what notions of feminine actually even mean. And there's a whole lot of energy that gets freed up when we get to choose that for ourselves rather than what we've just received as conditioning all our lives.
I really admire that you're willing to do that publicly and to learn and stumble, because particularly this year after Black Lives Matter and more people doing anti-racist work, I've seen some really big, well-known people that have, you know, big audiences that have committed to doing the work, but then when it's got a little bit messy or uncomfortable, they've just, you know, just all kinds of stuff, you know, deleting people's posts and not having an open space to talk. So that's, that's a real, there's a strength in that vulnerability, I think.
Yeah, well, it's a case of like, it's just this inner thing inside me that I know I have to do this and I have to stand by that. And if I want to hold safer spaces for everybody, then I have to be prepared to be uncomfortable. And it's a lifetime's learning. It's not something you can just do a weekend course in and tick a box, or put something on your website. If you've not done the inner work behind the scenes, you're not going to be able to hold safe space for clients, or I'm launching a training program in January, and so I really want to make sure that I want to clear my blind spots, really, and I want to help other people clear their blind spots too. And so I'm opening the space for those people who want to come on that ride with me. And at the same time, recognizing I've got a long way to go. I'm a baby in this. I'm not an expert, and I am going to stuff up. And when I stuff up, I'm open to holding my hands up and saying, okay, how do I do better? Show me. And I think that's all any of us can do.
Yeah, I'm just reflecting on that, because also that sense of, I don't know, when you're bringing things into the light in terms of just naming things as they are, unfortunately, just because things have been so suppressed, some of it is really toxic, or,
Yeah.
And also you're relating to your body in a way of what feels comfortable for you. And this comes up for me quite a lot of, so much of my experiences in women's health, and then not wanting to be marginalizing people because of language and things like that, but then also not adopting language that I'm not ready to claim, or that doesn't, that just feels like terminology rather than feeling fully embodied at this point.
Or that sense of, oh, now I should be using this word instead of and there's some things I'm still sat in that inquiry, and I'm actively seeking mentors to help me embody those things and to do the unpacking behind the scenes and stuff. So and it's something that luckily the mentor I'm working with in my anti-racism work, she gives space for integration and working with the nervous system and nice beautiful embodied practices, so that those other parts of me can integrate and digest and go through the discomfort, work things out in my own system, and then keep stepping forward. And it's interesting that's all happening at the same time that I've relocated from being overseas for 11 years, bouncing around the world, learning from many different cultures, and it's like now I'm back on my homeland. And I'm sat with, well, what's my ancestry? What are the lineage practices from my ancestry? And where's the spirituality here? And how do I tap into that and embody that? So there's all kinds of juicy inquiries going on, excuse me, in my system at the moment.
I'm curious, with that aspect of inquiry, do you think there might ever be a challenge between the things that you're already devoted to and that you already have practice? And how you incorporate both.
So this is something I've been sat with for a while, actually, of just like, well, learning more about different practices, and like, well, okay, and then I've got all these classical tantra practices, and how does that fit with exploring Celtic mythology and whatever else it is that I'm doing behind the scenes and connecting to the land and everything else. And something that's been really helpful for me is going back and looking at the ancient traditions, and seeing that in the really thousands of years ago, the older societies were matriarchal, and they were all worshipping forms of the female form, the goddess. And whether that's the early classical tantra or the early tantra traditions, or whether it was pagan, or whether it was the stuff in Europe, that they're all finding the same things, these worships of the yoni, of the vulva, of these round goddess figures and stuff that are shown up in archaeological digs. It's all showing that at the same essence, it's all one. And when we're at that point of my body is divine, the land I'm on is divine, Divine Mother is divine, we are all one, we're all connected. So it's just a different path up the mountain is the way that I'm kind of engaging in that inquiry at the moment. And that might change in the future, who knows. I keep an open mind on that and allow myself to be guided by these invisible threads. Yeah.
That definitely, to me, is one aspect of the deep healing work of actually reclaiming what comes from our own lineages. Like, you know, with me being born here, having parents that were born in East Africa and being of Indian origin, it's there's so much of like, where are my roots and things? And also so much of my exploration has come from Western teachers, even though I come from an Indian background. So it's the thing of, you know, just finding the alignment for myself with that, you know, finding my own power.
Yeah. And there's so much richness in that, isn't there? There's so much power in that. I was speaking to somebody yesterday who's saying, you know, she's going back and looking at her ancestry and stripping away like pre-colonial, you know, the pre-colonial stuff, and really tuning into that. And I just think there's so much power in that inquiry.
And you mentioned mentors and teachers a few times. I was curious about your relationship with kind of knowledge coming from somebody, because also you're clearly devoted in your own practices that you do, so you're gaining your own experience too.
Yeah, so I'm over the years, I think, because of the the experiences of working with or being in a cult for a while, it was my embodiment practices that really helped me come back to myself and find my own truth rather than being imposed specific teachings. And it's through working with Michaela Boehm, who I know is how we connected because we're both students of hers, that the tools she gave really helped me find myself again and be able to strip away what was dogma and what was my truth. And so that inquiry has helped me orient towards teachers who kind of do this in the same way. So really leaning towards mentors who can help me find the best or lean into things. I really do strongly believe in working with people rather than just fumbling along on your own trying to figure things out, because I did that for many years in kind of my own sexual healing journey. It was a long fumble the way around. It was a long, hard journey, and that's why I'm passionate about giving people tools to access this stuff in a much more efficient, quick way of like, you don't have to go and live in the jungle for 5 years. You know, I can help you uncover this stuff in 6 months instead. But I do still, I constantly like to be the student and to learn more, to discover more, to open to more. And that's beautiful. I think that keeps me in a humble state.
And one of the differences with Michaela as a teacher is her ability to hold space so that you're finding your own truth rather than being dogmatic, which is so refreshing compared to once you know it in your bones, you just know it. So
yeah, definitely. And that's it. And that's the approach that she really inspired me with. That is like, you know, just that you can hold a much better space for clients and in workshops when you're just guiding people to have their own experience rather than telling them it should be like this, or close your eyes and breathe in this way and feel this. It's like, no, discover for yourself what's there for you. And that's much more empowering for everybody.
And finally, you mentioned about the senses and just sensual pleasure rather than it always having to be sexual pleasure. What are just some really easy and accessible ways that people can connect with their senses?
Yeah, so I mean, this has been particularly important during lockdown. I found, like over the months, particularly when, you know, you're not able to go out and do all the things you want to do in the world. It's like you've got to actively cultivate more freshness and joy and pleasure in your life to get through and not have your system holding so much. So you can do this in many ways. I mean, one of the things I love to do, I just love being in the bath, and I love feeling but really paying attention to what I can feel. So I feel the warm water. I can smell the essential oils I've got burning. I can see beautiful flowers, or I can look at a candle. It's like just really consciously orientating yourself to things that feel good, look good, smell good, taste good, and just be present with that. And so for me particularly, what I have to constantly remind myself to do is to slow the F down. And, you know, I love drinking tea, is one of my favorite things in the world. So just to, rather than just be chugging away at tea while I'm on my desk and just being, functional. It's like, no, sit down on the back step with the door open, feel the fresh air, particularly if there's sunlight, and just to enjoy that and savor that cup of tea with the taste, and just, or eating chocolate in that way, whatever it is, just to really enjoy what you're doing and take the time to appreciate it. And that can also be just gentle touch on just gently touching yourself, whether it's rubbing the back of your neck or stroking your face, and just feeling what you can feel there. And particularly in self-touch, feeling, well, where am I being the toucher? So if I'm touching my face, I'm feeling my fingers. What are my fingers feeling? And then exploring the inquiry of, well, what is my face feeling? And kind of separating the two, and just like, wow. And it kind of opens us up to feeling much more subtlety. And the more subtlety we can feel and appreciate, the more our capacity to feel pleasure grows. And that's really lovely. And it has a really lovely effect on the nervous system as well. So it helps us just feel calm, grounded, just more open to feeling more pleasure. And what that then takes into the sexual domain is like, wow, suddenly everything starts to feel more alive. And that's really lovely too.
I love all those tips, because it's not just about self-care in terms of having the right yoga mat or the right athletic wear or all of those things. It's the things in your body in the here and now, always available.
Yeah, and you can do that anywhere. Like, I'm a huge fan of meditating in airports where it's really noisy and things like that. It's like these practices are meant to be anywhere, because we're in the real world. I'm in a very urban environment at the moment, and it's like I can still feel the fresh air. I can still appreciate the sun. Like we had a double rainbow the other day, and I was like, wow, like there is wonder and magic and beauty everywhere if we allow ourselves to view it. And that can really shift your whole perspective on life. And it's not about having the right gear or creating time in your schedule for a big practice necessarily. It's like, what can I do in my daily life to just feel more pleasure and more aliveness.
Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Oh, this has been a really beautiful conversation. We've gone in so many different directions.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please send me a comment on Twitter or Instagram at Avni Touch. Subscribe to Speak from the Body on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Go to avni-touch.com/podcast to get the show notes. And finally, please head over to iTunes to subscribe, rate and leave a review. It's very much appreciated. Thank you.